That is really weird.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's rock and roll here. All right, so I'm going to cover an awful lot, so I'm going to get right into it right now. So with yuccas, there's about 50 species, and they have leaves with margins that are smooth, with teeth, or with fibers.
Do you want to walk around? I can.
I'd love to
Yeah,
walk
yeah.
around. Yeah.
In your pocket.
Okay. Almost there. Make sure this. And they're generally divided into three groups. We have the fleshy fruited ones, that's your Sarcocarpa group. And then you dry fruited or capsule that produce capsules, that's what they call the Ketocarpans. And then the spongy fruit that y'all know, Joshua trees, and that's your Cleistocarpa group. It's the only genus in the subfamily, Agavoideae, that has all these different kinds of fruit types. So how are they pollinated? So y'all have flowers there, right? They're not welded yet? Okay, so it's really important to understand the morphology of them. But first off, though, let's go through this, this first part. So Charles Darwin thought that this yucca moth cycle was the most incredible thing he's ever heard of. And C.V. Riley was the first to discover this and publish on it back in 1872. And he recognized just one species, the Tegeticula, genus Tegeticula, the moth, Yuccacella, in the family Podoxidae. And he thought that that one species pollinated most of the yuccas. Okay, now we got your flower, right? So let's look at flower morphology real quick. So look at the base of your flower. Everybody got their flower, right? And you see the pedicel. That's the flower stalk, right? Okay. And the next, going up, then you'll have your tepals or your petals. There's 3 on the outer and 3 inner, right? You see that? Okay. Also, sometimes the petals will fuse at the base and form a cup or hypanthium. This one doesn't have too much. Okay, next layer would be the stamens. All right, and so you have the filaments. And are they fuzzy? Can you see? They have little hairs on them. And the top of them, and this is a male part, right? And the top of the filaments of your anthers. They're tiny, they're like little arrow-shaped little anthers at the very tip. Everybody with me so far? Okay. And then we have a superior ovary. Agaves have inferior, yuccas have superior ovary. And you see that elongated part here, right there, that's your style. Where do you think the stigma is?
Inside.
Yes. You got it. It is inside, and they call it the stigmatic cup. So it's inside that, which is very unusual. All right, yucca moth life cycle. Basically, so you have the adult males and the females, they emerge from the soil in the spring, and then they mate in the flowers after sunset. Well, the male moth, his job is done, he goes off, and he's pretty much history. They don't live long. But the female, now she's got to do a lot of the tasks now. So the female has to gather the pollen. She does it with her tentacles, and then she stores it under her head, right in her little chin. The pollen is sticky, so it's able to stick together in this little glob. And then she has a proboscis, so she may collect a little bit of water that's in there. I mean, it's a thirsty job, right? And then she will go to different flowers or probably different plants. So there's not self-fertilization, self-pollination. She deposits her eggs into a very specific place, so the ovary, of one to numerous flowers. And then she climbs up that same flower, climbs up the pistil, and stuffs pollen into the style. When C.V. Riley was describing that to all these scientists in this, in this great hall, they were like, "Are you out of your mind? There is no way an animal would purposely stuff pollen down," but they do. So when she's pollinated now, so the pollen tubes grow from the pollen, And then they fertilize the ovules, you get fertilization, and then they develop into seeds. So the eggs that she's deposited, either on or within the ovary, they hatch quickly. About 7 days, and they develop into the larvae, and the larvae will feed on their adjacent ovules of that yucca. And then you can see little holes. And the reasons they're not sure of, after a month, 2 months, 3 months, they exit. The larvae exit, and they drop to the ground, they burrow into the ground, and they form a cocoon, and they can be there for a long time, waiting for the right conditions. And they're still not sure of what triggers them to come out. And then they come out as adults, and they live a very short life and go through that whole cycle again. Until someone sticks a pin in them, yes. Thank you, Sue. So over the last 30 years, there's just been a tremendous amount of research on yucca pollination. And a huge shout out to these people, and there are others as well. And so this talk is based on their research, and I really hope that I interpreted it pretty well, their findings. I want to point out Ola Pelmir in the center. Unfortunately, he passed away way too young in life, but he had so many mentors, so many graduate students, and including these folks here that have really continued on his great work. And of course, yuccas, going back to William Trelease, but more recently Susan McKelvey in the 30s, Karen Clary, and then Maria Arteaga from Mexico. She's doing a lot of neat work in Baja with yuccas, so that's really cool. So now we know instead of one species, there are 25 species of Tetraticula that pollinate various yuccas. Most of them pollinate only one species. Others pollinate more than one, up to 6. So the first thing, what attracts these moths to the flowers? Moths can't see very well at all. And so the big white blossoms are an initial attractive to them from a distance. And it is at dusk when the females become active. They pick up floral scents. These species produce, some of them are unique and some share these floral scents with other yucca species, but the moths pick it up and they fly against the wind. So they're going in that direction. And that's how they're guided initially to the flower stalk. There are some really cool papers on the floral scent. And see if you can pick up a scent. It's very subtle in these flowers, but the insects are able to. So Andrew and I had an opportunity to go out in the field with Rob Raguso, who's pictured here, and he's doing a lot of work with yuccas scents. And he was sharing with us, this is up in southern Utah, he was sharing with us how an interesting find is unrelated yuccas that grow together have different scents, and related yuccas that do not grow together have similar scents. So he's very intrigued with this, and he and others are investigating this. But there are other yuccas that do produce unique floral scents. So now his job is for her to get the pollen. So it's really important to get good quantity and quality of pollen. The more and better the pollen, the better success of fertilization and fruit production. So the female moth, this is to me amazing. She gathers up to 10,000 pollen grains with her tentacles. And how does she know how much to collect? She has, you see the proboscis, and she has these tentacles. And there's all these hairs on the tentacles, and that's what she uses to collect the pollen. If you look on the right, there's the male, and he doesn't have those tentacles, just a little bump. And on the surface are these hairs, and they're called sensillets. And they think that this helps them, these hairs help keep the pollen together, even though they're sticky, but also helps her to figure out how much to collect, because they're tiny little moths, and pollen does weigh something. so that she doesn't want to be encumbered carrying too much pollen. And so these sensilla may help her figure it out, gauging how much pollen to collect. So once she leaves, collects her pollen, she goes to another plant, another flower, probably another plant. And so how does the females deposit the eggs after she gathers the pollen? She does it in two ways. She could oviposit into the ovary below the surface next to the ovules, or close to the surface within or just below the ovary wall. And then the larvae chew into the fruit and eat the seeds. Two very different ways. How they deposit the eggs and any egg mortality that comes from ovipositing, okay, can influence the shape of the fruit. And just to give you an example, soap tree yucca, it's pollinated solely by Tegeticula elatella. She deposits her eggs near or on the surface of the ovary, and there's little constriction. And I found too that the wall of the fruit is very thick relative to other species of yucca. Angostissima, slimleaf yucca, there's more than one moth species that pollinates them. Mainly, the moth deposits her eggs below the surface of the ovary, so it gets this constriction. So she's oviposited, and those ovules won't develop, and that's how you get that constriction. Some do deposit on the surface, and you won't get as much constriction. And so people, taxonomists, would often use this as a character in distinguishing certain yucca species or varieties of yucca, how much they're constricted, but you got to be careful of that, right? Now, banana yucca is pollinated solely by one, Tegeticula baccatella. She will deposit her eggs in the middle and the top of the ovary. So you can see here, so the eggs, the ovules are in the top, but she deposits her eggs at the base, and she deposits her eggs in the lower part there. Remember, so this is inverted. So the top is up here and the bottom is here. So you can see most of the ovules are up in the where she doesn't oviposit. So after she oviposits, she unloads her pollen, and she decreases her pollen load with each pollination attempt. And she adjusts, this blows my mind. She adjusts how much pollen to stuff by assessing how much pollen is in the stigma cap. I think that's amazing. She is able to figure out, she doesn't want to unload all her pollen on one flower, right? And so she also doesn't want to have any left over when she's done. She's able to gauge how much pollen to deposit. And they think that possibly the sensilla, those little hairs, may have something to do with that gauging, being able to figure out. I don't know, I think that is pretty amazing. Now, is there a limit to visits? You don't want all your seed eaten up, right? That's not good for the plant. And then, of course, wouldn't be good for the moths, because then you wouldn't have any plants to get pollen from. So the moth is very particular. She inspects the suitability of each flower. It's very, very important. They're still trying to find out what exactly are they cueing in on, but they do know that there is what we call host marking. The visiting moth, she will deposit a pheromone each time she oviposits. Now the flowers will abort if the moth oviposits a certain number of times. You can get a lot of floral abortion on one inflorescence. I mean, up to 90%. That's a lot of flowers aborting. So they will abort if there's too high a pheromone level, and if there's wounding of too many ovules, and if there are too many eggs that are laid. And this surprised me. So there's 3 chambers in the pistil, in the ovary, they're called locules. And they would generally maybe 1 or 2 per locule. So apparently it seems that the magic number is less than 7, but definitely if you get more than 13 per fruit, not per locule, flowers will abscess. They will visit a previously visited flower, but they reduce the number of times that she will oviposit and pollinate them. Again, she's gauging. That little brain of hers. Now, remember when I said they oviposit in two different ways? Into the ovary, below the surface, next to the ovules? Well, the advantage of doing that, eggs escape predation, but the ovules are at risk of being damaged by ovipositing, right? Well, how about though if she oviposits on or close to the surface, within or just below the ovary wall, it increases the chance of predation. But there's a plus side, it decreases the chance of injuring the ovules and flower abscission, so you get more fruit maturing. How many larvae, how much seed is destroyed per fruit? There's not a lot of research on this. There was a paper on Yucca shedidra, which is the Mohave yucca, and excuse me, and the number of larvae per fruit was highly variable, from 3 to 6 total. Okay, the seeds consumed is also highly variable, but it's generally not very much. Definitely less than 40, as low as 10%. So it's quite the evolutionary dance, really. You get more and better pollen, the better for both. The moth will adjust. Too many visits will result in increased risk of flower abscising, and the moths recognize cues. Fewer eggs laid will result in retention of the flower. The few eggs will develop just fine, and the plants will produce really good fruit and very good viable seed. So it's quite a dance, really, in getting it all right. Then there's the discovery of more pollinators. So we have the genus Tentaticula, and then there's a second genus called Paratentaticula. And they're quite different from Tentaticula. The female, she makes a shallow groove in the pedicel. You all know what the pedicel is, right? The stalk of the flower that you have. Or in the petal, and then she lays her eggs in this groove, and then she goes up, stuffs pollen into the style and stigma. The stigma inside, of course. The larvae will bore into the young fruit, as it's created, and it creates a gall where there's no seeds, where no seeds are produced. And the larvae feed on the tissue of the gall. And then there's another group of yucca moths. And these are called the bogus moths, genus Prodoxus. And this was actually discovered by Riley back in the late 1800s. They have no tentacles. There's no collection of pollen. There's no pollination of flowers. The larvae feed on other parts of the yuccas. They do not feed on seeds. Okay. They complete their life cycle in the host, not the ground, in the host, and they emerge from tissue, plant tissue, as adults. And there's still another group of moths, the cheaters, the cheater moths. There's two species, Intermedia and Corruptrix. And researchers believe that they evolved from the moths that oviposit on the surface very recently, 3.2, 1.8 million years ago. And they have about 4 to 6 hosts. And so, question, of course, why are they called cheaters? They don't pollinate the flowers, but they deposit their eggs into the maturing fruit. And so you have two different ones. The intermediate, we call them early cheaters because they deposit their eggs near the surface of slightly matured fruit. And then you have those late cheaters. They deposit their eggs deeper into the large developing seeds. So what you have is the plants or the flowers decide, okay, now I'm going to put all my energy into producing the fruit. And these little guys, they cue in. They know when that time is. And they go in, skip the pollinating. I'm going for depositing my eggs in there. Fascinating. You look at the mouth parts of the female cheater, and look, no tentacles. She's lost them. She doesn't need them, right? So it begs the question, are there cheater plants? You think so? So it's not common to see this, but so we got Tentaticula baccatella with banana yuccas. Remember, she deposits the eggs near the middle and the top of ovary, right there, okay? Some plants, though, they have an ovary with very few viable ovules near the base, okay? And then so There's fewer flowers. They produce fewer flowers, but they do produce more fruit with fewer larvae. And so what you get from that, so the larvae, they're sunk. They have no ovules. There's nothing to feed on. And so, but you do get a greater seed mass, but fewer seeds. So I think that there's probably more out there, like cheater plants. So one yucca, you got a lot going on. So you got your pollinating moths, your bogus moths, your larvae and your cocoons of your various moths. Then you got your cheater moths and their larvae and cocoons. So a lot is going on just in one particular plant. So a summary of that little part. So we have 3 genera of moths associated with yuccas: Tetraticula, Paratetraticula, and Podoxus. There's about 54 species for all 3 groups. Most Tetraticula are pollinators, all are seed eaters. All Paratetraticula are pollinators, none are seed eaters. And Podoxus does not pollinate, and the larvae do not feed on the seeds. And these 2 references right here are really good reviews of, of what is going on. So I highly recommend both of those. So what do we have here in southern Arizona? So dry fruited, you're probably very aware of the soap tree yucca. It is solely pollinated by Elatella, which is a surface ovipositor. But the cheater moth does hit the young fruits. Even though they're dry capsules, they can, when they're young, they're still green. And the fleshy fruited ones, now we don't recognize baccata as occurring in southern Arizona. We think that it's that the species is Yucca arizonica, and it's different from baccata. But we think we know that Baccatella, who does pollinate banana yucca, is also a pollinator of arizonica, and this one too gets hit with a cheater moth. And then you have Schatz yucca, Yucca Schattii. Its sole pollinator is Tetraticula maderi, which is named for Madera Canyon. Okay. And there's no evidence that cheaters hit it. So you're wondering, well, wait a minute, I heard that Yucca Schattii is now madrensis. Andrew and I are working on this, and we agree with Dr. Gentry that madrensis is a different species found only in Sonora and Chihuahua. It is not, does not occur up here. So we're recognizing and keeping Schattii as the species that we have up here. And there's differences. You can see in the habit of the plant, here's madrensis and here's Schattii. Here's a leaf, you can see the little teeth on the margin. There's no teeth on the margins here. The flowers are deeper, small inflorescence. This is a filament with a pubescence. So far, we see that the filaments do not have any pubescence on them. So, and we're going to be publishing this in Systematic Botany. So to me, like a lot of those moths sort of look alike, but the devil's in the details. And this really interested me. I thought this was pretty cool. So up here, these are the ovipositors. And they really do match how they oviposit the ovaries of their particular species. Baccatella, it oviposits into the ovary between the walls and the ovules, and it's pretty big. This is a pretty big ovipositor, and the tips are pretty large too, right here. Corruptrix, these are the cheater. They're either into the fruit, like in the banana yucca, or superficial, like in Yucca elata, the sultry yucca. And that's why you got 2 different forms right here. This is the baccata one, hits baccata, and this is the one that hits the superficial one that hits sultry yucca. And you can see the difference here in size and all. And they think too that these are actually probably going to be designated as 2 different species. So it'd be another cheater. And Elatella here's your Elatella that hits sultry yucca. That's a superficial, just into the ovary wall right here. It's very small, cute little thing right there. And then Madera is sort of in between, into the ovary between the walls and the ovules. So this does provide evidence that there's this mutualistic coevolution of the 2, although the jury's still out on that. So how and when did pollinator mouths evolve? So I was interested in that, and I hope I can get this, interpret all this correctly. They are in the order Lepidoptera and the Podoxidae, one of 126 families in this order. And I think that this family evolved about 95 to 100 million years ago. And they think that this little moth, Graia, is a close relative of the yucca moth. At least they thought it at the time. They may have changed their mind now. But the Graia, they're host specific in the saxifrage and the umbel carrot families. They mate in the flowers and they deposit eggs into the ovary, and some feed on seeds. Some other genera, Hesperoyucca, they are host specific. They're nectar feeders. Females deposit eggs in the ovary. Most seeds are eaten. There's no pollination. And we see them now with Nolina, beargrass, and Dazzlerium, Socto. And then there's Podoxis, which the family is named for. And they feed on Agavoides, the subfamily Agave. And they're host-specific nectar feeders. They deposit eggs, though, in agave stalks, and there's no pollination. And they're associated with all agaves. So looking at the origin, figuring out the origins of this amazing relationship, they think that it originated about 40 to 32 million years ago. Yucca moth ancestors, they foraged for nectar with their proboscis, and pollination was accidental, it was passive. They were very selective, though, of hosts, and they did oviposit into the plant ovaries. The larvae fed on the seeds and destroyed a limited seed. So already you've got a lot of behaviors that are already there to switch over, to evolve into true yucca moths. So how do you get from gray to tetraticula? So they think that it's, the most uncomplicated way is just changing behavior. So you have more precise placement of pollen, development of the tentacles, and this becoming a sole pollinator, which is a lot easier to do than a lot of the other theories and that they've come up with. The yucca ancestors, they produced nectar. They relied on many kinds of nectar-feeding pollinators, and pollination was accidental. This, by the way, is a fossilized, fossils are very rare. This was found in Nevada, and it's very similar to what you see in Joshua Tree. This was a chunk fossil, it was called Proto-Yucca shadishii. And they dated it to 14.5 million years ago, and now they think it could be sister to yucca, true yucca. So true yuccas keep shifting when they think that they evolved, and now the most recent estimate is relatively recent, about 6 to 4 million years ago. And so these true yuccas produce little or no nectar. They relied on specific pollinators, and pollination was very purposeful and selective. And so with the development of North American deserts, there was a big expansion of yucca divergence, diverging in different species, especially just in the last 2 million years. And I'm just going to highlight a few things here. I love this phylogeny of the family. And I hope I interpret it correctly. I just want to point out a few things. So you see up here, 85 million years ago, developed a lineage or lineages that eventually produced the genus, evolved in genus Graia. And then right here, 44 million years ago, you have a branch going off in evolution of Mesopola. And right here, this branch is going off, and they're going to be feeding on Agavoides. And then 41.5 million years ago, it branches off, and that's how you get the Podoxis here eventually, right at that time. And then this branch going off where you get them feeding on yuccas. So you come down here, and this is where pollination comes in. Whoops, I just want to back up a little bit. So they're now feeding the Podoxis, 41.5, the lineages, and those are Podoxis species. Again, these are not pollinators, okay? But at 35.6 million years ago, this is when they diverged off the lineages to producing, evolving the yucca moth pollinators. What's weird though is this particular one is maculata, and that is the pollinator of Hesperoyucca. And that age is really old, 40 million years old. There's an issue with that. And so at 41.7 million years ago, there's another branch off, and that, and then later, 21.9 million years ago, and this is where you're getting branched off into your, let me back up here real quick. You have a branch going off into that eventually, very recently, formed the two pollinators for Joshua tree right there. And then this branch going off, and this is evolving to your Yucca stella complex. And this is where you see a lot of diversity of not only the moths, but also the yuccas. I like this one right here because it's better resolved. And thus you can see the yellow, these are your superficial ovipositing moths. And these two, these right here, and the orange, those are your cheater moths. So it's really good molecular evidence that is showing that the cheaters evolved very recently from superficial depositing moths. So, so we have Hesperoyucca pollinators at 40 million years, but Hesperoyucca, they think, probably diverged from ancestor 14 million years ago. So there's a huge gap, right? And there's theories of why that is. I won't get into them now because it's sort of complicated and I'm not sure if I quite understand it. But it does agree pretty well with the yucca's age, about 6 to 4 million years ago. And you have all this diversity going on here of the yucca moths. And this is a time when there is a great origin of true yuccas and a lot of diversity within these 4 to 1 million years ago. They rapidly evolved for various reasons. This really surprised me. So again, here's your two pollinators of Joshua trees, the two different species. And very recent, 1.1 million years ago, Joshua trees, the latest research says that they diverged, the two species diverged from their most recent common ancestor only 200,000 to 100,000 years ago, which floors me. That's quick. So who is this Hesperoyucca, you might ask? It's one of my favorite plants on the planet. So a lot of people had considered Hesperoyucca to be a type of yucca, but there's a lot of differences. For one thing, Hesperoyucca has this capitate stigma. See this right here? This bright green versus, of course, being inside. And there's a little depression right in there too. The filaments, you can see they're really thick and they're longer than the pistil. And they're attached to the base of the tepals. They're glabrous. There's no hairs on them. You see the hairs on the filaments here. But there's little hairs. You can't see them on the tuft of the anthers, which is pretty cute. Surprisingly, so Hesperoyucca, the most recent idea is that they evolved, their age is about 14 million years. And they're most closely related to red yucca, Hesperoyucca. We recognize 3 species, Whipplei of Southern California and Northern Baja, and Peninsularis, Baja California Sur and Baja California Norte. And then our Hesperoyucca newberrii that's found in the Grand Canyon, and this really interesting population on the Arizona-Sonora border right here that Tony and Richard had collected. Yeah, got ideas about that. If we have time, I'll go into it. So, newberrii had been considered like a variety of Whipplei or a synonym of Whipplei. Didn't get respect. Well, it's it's distinct from Whipplei and Peninsularis. As a matter of fact, Whipplei and Peninsularis are more closely related to each other than they are to newberrii. What about the moths, the pollinators? They diverged about 40 million years ago, and there's two subspecies of Tetraticulum maculata, which diverged about 10 million years ago. Subspecies maculata is the pollinator of Whipplei in California. Subspecies extraña pollinates Whipplei and the northern populations of Peninsularis. Okay, what about Newberrii? Ha! Well, they couldn't figure it out. It's diverged so much that it has affinities with this one, but it's really not it. And so we're catching it at a time when it's diverging from extraneum. And they think that it's because it's been isolated for at least 11,000 years. And that in general, the moths, the Hesperoyucca, the moths and plants development and distribution is related to the Pleistocene and Holocene events. Okay. Well, that went on. So what's the Pleistocene? Up to 2.8, 3.2 million years ago, at least 20 intervals of glacial, interglacial episodes, glacial cooling, interglacial warming. So all this is going on, and it really affects plants. It fragments populations, brings them together, fragments, and the same thing with their pollinators too. So we know a lot about what went on during glacial and interglacial, looking at the most recent times. And this 30,000 to 8,500 years before present. So in Western Grand Canyon, we know because of pack rat middens, okay, now I'll go into that a little bit more, that the climate was very different. Just that, not that long ago. The inner canyon, we had down into the canyon was an open woodland, open juniper woodland. And then during the Holocene, of course, it's warming up. Holocene, there's a lot more warming up. And then the woodland species retreated to the rims and are also found in protected north-facing slopes and drainages. What I find interesting too, though, is many of the species at that time that were down there are still present. And these include these Mohave Desert plants, brittlebush, opuntia, and ferrocactus. And there's a reason for that. So, so I mentioned there's a cute little pack rat right there. And what they like to do, they gather a lot of things within us, 40 meters or something like that, and brings them back to her nest. And thousands of years later, researchers and scientists like to go into the nest and figure out what she has collected there, and then they date them. And they found Hesperoyucca leaves along the Colorado River corridor here. In this area, even during glacial periods, we know that it was warmer than the adjacent areas along this stretch here. So with looking at the pack rat middens, they figured out that they're not there anymore, and they disappeared at least during the last 10 to 12,000 years. And again, this is a really period of rapid warming and drying. They're not there anymore. And this reminds me too, this is Joshua Tree. These triangles are the fossil records. To me, they're very similar. And this was the potential habitat. You see current versus 22,000 to 13,000. And so you see the current distribution here. And then you see the Pleistocene distribution extrapolated from that. And I think it's a very similar pattern to this. Right now, Hesperoyucca newberrii is only here and here. That's it. And I have a feeling that this pattern comes up with other species as well. So it'd be really interesting to look into. So Hesperoyucca newberrii is found, it's mostly common on north-facing slopes. So the Grand Canyon does offer these plants, as well as many others, like a refuge in this warming, and definitely will be as the climate continues to get warmer. And indeed, this population right down here on the border are on north-facing slopes. So a big question is, how are these and all these plants, Yuccas, Hesperoyuccas, and their pollinators going to do? Are they doing now? How are they doing now? And how would they do in the future? And so there's so much information that we need to gather, that is being gathered, that has been gathered, and pulling it all together. And this is just some of them. but including deep history and distribution modeling. There's been a lot of attention on the Mojave Desert for good reason too. It's getting impacted big time. A lot of attention on the Joshua trees. And so if you do a Google search, there's quite a bit that addresses this and some really good data. This one struck me as very interesting. This includes a summary of publications that did address what are the factors that initiates yucca flowering. Okay, there's not much written on that. And so this is a good paper to read because it does go over, reviews some of the publications. So and I'm concerned for this one in particular, Hesperoyucca newberrii. Compared, it's just not gotten the respect or attention it deserves. Compared to Hesperoyucca whipplei, which is the common one when you drive to San Diego, you bypass lots of these beautiful plants. 1,400 plus iNaturalist observations, 3 of newberrii, 1,400 specimens of whipplei and cynet, 146, most of them are from us, of newberrii. Publications, over 300 for whipplei, 4 for newberrii. And I think part of the problem is it was lumped into, Hesperoyucca whipplei, and it's very difficult to access. So, people are going to want to go out there and try to do their studies. So in trying to figure out, I mentioned, earlier about the International Union of Conservation of Nature, the IUCN Red List assessment. It's very important, it's very valuable. So all of this information we're pulling together. So we and others are responsible for doing the Yucca assessments, the Agave and Hesperoyucca. And so pulling all this information together to decide, okay, is this vulnerable? Is it of least concern? Is it threatened? And that's what we have to do, and we publish it. One of the most important things to me anyways is figuring out what species grows where, right? And so we better have a really good idea of what species are there. And so in Grand Canyon, we have what we call cryptic species. Cryptic species are species that are called A, but in reality are B, and maybe B, C, and D. We've overlooked them. It's not the common one. They may be different, and they've been overlooked. This one is in Marble Canyon. I think it's a new species. And we're doing molecular as well as other studies on it, as well as this one. This is in Central and Western Grand Canyon. I cannot put a name on that. And I think it could very well be a new species, which would not be unexpected at a place like Grand Canyon. And it's not with just plants. And to me, this really brings out the importance of it. Especially in the last few years, they've been finding cryptic species with animals. And these are a few of the examples. For example, like with the killer whales, you have 3 different species. With each of these cases, they found that they have different breeding areas, different feeding areas, different niches. It's the same way with plants. If we overlook them, we're going to lose them. So this is really important. And then hybridization. There was a time, except for John Weber, he said they're hybridizing all the time. And then it was like, well, yuccas don't hybridize much. And you really need to know to help figure out what species are what, as well as figuring out if there is indeed hybridization. It can be, especially in long living perennials like yuccas and agaves, an important step in evolving into a different species, okay? So they do hybridize, and we're finding more and more of that. So this was reported, these are the 2 Joshua trees, the Western brevifolia and Jaegeriana. The eastern one, that's the one you see from Wickenburg up to Lake Mead. And they have 2 different, as I mentioned earlier, 2 different pollinators here, synthetica and antithetica, and they do hybridize. The plants hybridize. Whether the pollinators do, there's very little work on whether pollinators hybridize. There is evidence that they do, but it's rare. Here's another one. These are fleshy fruited ones, baccata times shaditra. Baccata, again, pollinated by Tetraticula baccatella. That's a misspelling there. Corruptrix is not a pollinator. Remember, that's a cheater. Shadidra is pollinated solely by Tetraticula mohavella. It also is visited by the non-pollinator Corruptrix. So these they do hybridize. There is another hybrid down in Baja, Yucca capensis. These are both fleshy fruited, hybridizing with Valida. And this is Maria Arteaga's and others' work. But what about hybridization between very different yuccas? Fleshy fruited versus a dry fruited species, okay? Some people, if you look in Florida, North America, said it's basically impossible, and they doubt it happens. It does happen. The first report of it was a species called Yucca gloriosa, and it occurs on the east coast of the country. Albifolia is a fleshy fruit, and filamentosa is a dry fruited one, and evolved into this named species, gloriosa. And that was the first published report on such a cross. But in Arizona, we're finding them a lot. And here we have Yucca elata, that pollinated by Tetraticula elatella, and then Yucca shadii, pollinated by Tetraticula maderi. And and they pollinate and they hybridize, and you have this form. This is in the Las Ciénegas area. And so this is really an interesting question. You have very different pollinators that somehow are able to do it and create these hybrids. The other interesting thing about it too is the type of photosynthesis that these two plants have. So the fleshy fruit generally is CAM photosynthesis, crassulation acid metabolism photosynthesis. These are C3 plants, typical, yeah. So there's something going on here. Carolina Hayduke, right there, she is looking into that as well, and how that is resulting too, and looking deeper into that whole aspect. Up in the Grand Canyon, I love these. You have Yucca baccata, again pollinated by Baccatella. There's the cheater. It doesn't pollinate, of course. And then here's, I'm not even sure if it's Angostissima. It's not falling out with that. Could be something new. And Angostissima is pollinated by Altiplana, which is a deep, pollinates, oviposits deep in the fruit, as well as this pollinator who she pollinates on the surface of the fruit. So two very different. And they hybridize and get this form. We don't know what the pollinators are. And it'd be a really fun study. And Western Grand Canyon, similar thing. Baccata, there's your pollinator. Utahensis, Utah yucca, it's pollinated solely by superficiala, which is superficial on the ovary wall, and they produce these yuccas. They are not uncommon. That's the thing too. And when you find them, you find a lot of them in a particular area. Another great research project. And another one. I'm finding, they're not really uncommon. This is Yucca bailey. It's a Colorado Plateau species, dry fruited one. All right. And this is the fleshy fruited baccata again. Kind of gets around a lot. And these are the two pollinators for bailey. And again, you have this hybrid formed. And this too is, this one was up in Vermilion Cliffs. There's a population up there. So it's pretty cool. One we haven't talked about, and they don't know if it hybridizes with anything as yet, and this is the Canab Yucca canabensis. And there's Rob and Andrew there. It's a big dry fruited plant. And these are the two moths that pollinate it. And you can see one that goes deep into the fruit, deep into the ovary, and this is one superficial on the ovary wall. So you have two different types of ovipositing on the one species. So this one I like, this little cutie. This is northeastern Utah, and they call it Yucca sterilis because nobody's ever seen fruit produced of it. So it begs the question, some people have named it as a good species. Some people think it's just a form of Harriman's yucca, which is common throughout Utah. We don't know. And so this is something that we're looking at. We'd love, again, to see if someone can look and see if there's any pollinators. We've never seen any moths. A lot of times when you open up the flower, you'll see the little moths in there. They're resting during the daytime, but we've never seen them. And again, never seen any fruit. So I talked a lot about herbarium specimens earlier. And so I don't want to go into a whole lot more, but they're incredibly, incredibly important and providing us so much information now, as well as information, questions we haven't even thought of. And again, not only with these hard to collect yuccas, agaves, but also with cacti too. It's the same issue. They're hard to assess because of the lack of specimens. And again, we need them. And again, as I mentioned, cacti is really critical too. They're the 5th most endangered organism on the planet. But also too, there are yuccas that are threatened and there are agaves that are threatened too. So, and I mentioned this, Madison, that's her name. This really cool use of herbarium specimens, and she's still working on it for a PhD. When she compared plants collected in the Guadalupe Mountains in Texas, in the Sonoran Desert, with specimens that Tony Burgess collected 50 years ago. She wanted to answer the question, did plants adjust to changing temperatures and lower rainfall totals? And yes, they did. With many of the herbaceous, it was like 40% of those sampled. They showed higher water use efficiency and decrease in stomatal density and size. There was less genetic diversity though. And so you can log on to that site right there, and there's a really nice article on their work. So again, I mentioned too, if you want to, we did a whole video on how to collect yuccas and agaves and cacti too, Irene Pajek and I, and in the introduction, I said, you know, it's like you need a suit of armor to go out and collect these things. And so I was like, let's go get a suit of armor. And so we did. And so in the introduction, there's a picture of, not a picture, there's a whole video of me trying to move around in a real suit of armor, which was really difficult, but it's pretty fun. And so again, getting a lot of information as much as you can. These close-ups, for iNaturalists, for you folks that do iNaturalists, get close-up of flowers as well as fruits too. That really helps with the ID identification. And fruits, speaking of fruits, nobody likes to collect fruits because they take up so much space in the herbarium, but you gotta. But again, I talk about how you can do it. You soak them in water, just not for a couple of hours, and then you can press them a little better without them losing their integrity. And you make really nice specimens. Because there are differences in fruits, but people don't collect the fruits. And so, you know, collect them. So, and then finally, you know, I always like to say this and promote this. And the words of Carrie Cannon, who said this a lot too. She's up in Peach Springs, works with Wallapai. We need to involve Indigenous folks with all aspects. And, you know, yuccas are super important, and Hesperoyucca as well, very important to Indigenous people. And of course, for food, as well as for fiber, for ceremony. And so I just want to end here with, well, let me say this too. So one of the questions too, did they manipulate plants? Of course they did. You know, we see it with agaves, we see it with yuccas. These are really long-leaved yuccas that are found in a spot in Grand Canyon where there is also evidence of a terracine, and where Agave phillipsiana, which is one of our pre-contact agave domesticates, also grows. So all these little things are just begging to be investigated. So again, there's a saying, you can't do conservation without the involvement of Indigenous people. So, thank you. Thank you all so much for hanging in there. All you Zoomers out there, thank you. And yeah, thank the Wallapai, Grand Canyon, all the researchers, and our little guy. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks. That was fun.
Were you going to play your clip of the movie?
No. You know, I should have. But if you get on, at least you'll see the intro. That's pretty fun. See, yeah.
Why do the stamens do that?
So, I don't know. That's a great question. Yeah, Hesperoyuccas are straight up. And then when they're mature, the stamens, and they have this like little swollen tip. So they go up, you can see it in your specimen, and then it's swollen, and that's where the bend is. I call it like an elbow. And then you find the little anther at the tip there.
Could it be that it's keeping the people open,
Hmm,
away from the insect?
possibly. That's a great question. I don't know. I have to think about that. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Does it allow the boss more manipulating or hanging on to area when it's gathering pollen? Sort of perch on that little bulge.
It could be. It could be. I've not seen anything referencing that. It's not to say it's not there. Yeah. So that's a great question. Because I wonder that too. Because I take measurements, and then I get, I'm trying to measure the filament, and it's like the and then I wonder why. Yeah. Good question. I don't know.
We have a question from group chat. Could you please talk about why many times banana yucca doesn't fruit? Do yucca need to be outcrossed?
Yes, yuccas do need to be outcrossed, and that's why it's important. That moth, she collects her pollen, she's got to move, which takes energy. And there has been research done, for example, too, in how many flowers does she visit and how the distance she will go to pollinate and to oviposit and to pollinate, and oviposit. And so it depends on so many variables and factors. The climate, precipitation, temperature, which affects production of flowers, in plants. Why do they produce flowers some years and not other years? Some people have said, well, they're storing up energy and it takes them that time. I don't think so, because I've seen the same population flower in consecutive years too. So there's a lot of factors. Why are the moths not there? What triggers the moths to come out? Is it in sync as well? There's a lot of, this is what's amazing to me. There are a lot of ways it could go south, could go wrong, but it's so tight. It's pretty tight. There's some flexibility. They're able to do it. And why certain Yucca baccatas don't produce fruit? There could have been a lot of aborted flowers. The visitors, the moths may just not have been there. They may, as I said, may not have come out due to various factors. So I did read one where when you increase in elevation, I think it was baccata, that with cooler temperatures, they put more energy into vegetative reproduction and flowering. That's one paper. Yeah. Oh.
Of the three types of reproductive strategies for the yucca moth, is there any evidence that some are more successful than others? See, the cheaters would be more energetic fish, and that might have impacts for the future of yucca than the moths.
So you think the cheaters will be more successful, or yeah? Well, yeah. I mean, there's that. That begs that question of, is it really this mutualistic kumbaya kind of thing? This plant does this, helps this plant. Some people say it's an arms race. It's probably a combination of both. But you still have to have the fruits produced, or to produce, and you have to have those other moths to do that, because they're only coming in when it's developing the fruit. So if you don't have any fruit developing, you're not going to have cheaters, right? Yeah. Yeah. And then, Randy.
Mine was
just wanted to comment, if there are cheaters around, it's, things are going well.
Mhm.
So. I mean,
There's fruits.
Right, so
They're fruits,
if.
but they're not getting pollinated.
Right.
Well, they are by somebody.
Well, they are by
By
some, right,
other-
yeah, right,
Right,
yeah,
so
Cheaters
if there's
wouldn't be there.
cheaters around, things are doing very well.
yeah.
Things are going very well. And then the other thing about why doesn't the fruit get produced? Just because I plant something in my area doesn't mean the insect is anywhere near me.
Yep.
And I run into
Exactly.
that.
Exactly,
So, and
yeah,
what am I gonna do, go buy it? Or, you know, put a sign up for it,
yeah.
you know?
But that's true. Yeah, a lot of times if, landscaping, you're not gonna get them. You're not gonna get fruit production. At the garden, there's a Yucca baccata that just is trying so hard, each year, this poor little fruit. But never makes it, but we don't have moths there. And, well, and you saw sterilis too. Why is Yucca sterilis not producing fruit? There just no moths there? I've never seen them in the flowers. Not that let me backtrack a little bit. I've seen very few in flower. You have to be there right at the right week. It's a very tight time of flowering. So yeah, that could be a very good reason. They're just not there.
I don't know, in landscaping, urban landscaping or personal landscaping, people use fertilizers of all different types.
Mhm.
And I have to believe that changes the plant. So the fragrance could be different, this is all
Mhm.
guessing.
Yeah.
And so then the signal might be missed.
Mhm.
And I don't-
Mhm. It's very possible. It is very possible. Yeah.
Let me just say, if any of you have to get up and leave, we've gone over time, so you feel free to get up and exit if you have to, but we'll keep taking questions for a little while until she
Sure.
passes out.
Until we all pass out. Andy, you had a question. Okay.
How, in amongst the hybrid groups you've met,
Mhm.
how extensive are the hybrids?
Yeah, the Grand Canyon ones, when you find a population, there's several, there are many. The one on Tanner, I don't know if you're familiar with the Grand Canyon, but Tanner Trail, there's a whole slew of them.
Yeah.
And then also on the South Bass, there's a whole slew as you go out across the Esplanade and you find them. So it's weird. It's like in these areas, you find a lot of them, but then you don't find them again in big areas. So is there something going on that's channeling or, making the malls, crossing them more? And I don't know, but Vermilion, it's patchy.
Assuming that means both parents are in close proximity.
Yeah, yeah.
And so-
Both parents are. They have different flowering times though, too.
That's hard.
A little bit. Baccata is a little bit earlier, April, and Utahensis and this angustissima thing. It's a little late, well, in May. There might be some overlap, So
Are they reproducing as well?
yes, I've seen the fruits are cute. It's like they can't figure out which one they want to be. They're pretty intermediate, and they're not really capsular, and they're not really fleshy. They're in between. And we have gotten a little bit of seed, but not much. It's rare, but they
Yeah,
do
that's right.
produce fruit.
I would think that some of the pollinators are gonna discriminate. If they're well adapted to one parent or the other.
Yeah, yeah.
They would probably come back to the middle and say, maybe this is a. Because if I'm not gonna put a lot of energy into pollinating or depositing huge amounts of pollen,
Mm-hmm.
if I don't think I'm gonna get seed,
Right,
right, if that's
Right.
not paying,
right.
because my larvae, what, they're like a machine.
Yeah.
I'd just be curious.
Yeah, I know, there's like with the Joshua trees, there's really good work on the Joshua tree hybrids. And they're in one area up in Nevada. And they're correlating so in Joshua trees, I didn't mention this, she oviposits in the style. The style is really short on Joshua tree flowers. And so the ovipositors on the two different species are different. One's longer than the other. And so there is a one-way, more of a one-way transfer. And so longer into the shorter. I've noticed in Grand Canyon with the hybrids, like the ones on Tanner, they look more like bacata, the banana, a little bit less, you know, and not quite so over on the South Bass. And then Vermilion, they're sort of in between. So I don't know if there's more of a favorite, you know, I don't know. I would love for someone to do, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna write to Christopher Smith, who's done a lot of work. You've seen his name up on these papers, begging him, do you have a student, or if you know anyone to look at these, because they're begging for research. But yeah, great question.
The idea that a moth associated with one will visit another one that is not normally associated with, and that's how. So is it more of the almost preferences rather than primary?
Yeah, I mean, I've read too where, you know, they're going to try to pollinate, especially if there's tough conditions, you know, again, it's so variable. Conditions have to be pretty right. And they're going to go and visit other yuccas too. I've read that, you know, they're not as, you know, they're going to visit them, you know, whether they oviposit, you know, I don't know. I have to reread, you know, look at the papers, but so maybe under certain conditions that they become more like favoring different ones. That's been thrown out too. I don't know. Yeah, these are all great questions. I have no answer to. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Another question from group chat. The hybrid of Joshua tree doesn't demonstrate hybrid vigor. Could you please talk about other hybrids? Do they grow vigorously?
The ones that I've seen, I would not say they are more vigorous. It depends too on what you mean by vigorous too, so.
And let's see, I think there's a couple more questions from group chat. One is, botanically speaking, what sets Mesic yucca and xeric yucca apart?
Mesic species and xeric species, like the Mesic ones from the eastern United States, maybe.
What sets them apart?
Right.
Botanically. There is
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, if you look in Flora, North America, and it would have in the Keys. And so a lot of the characteristics are, number one, you know, fruit type. And then not only fruit type, fruit length, and then floral leaves are also characteristics. They're the habit of them, they're more flaccid for one thing. You know, the leaves are sort of droopy on the eastern ones, so it appears to me. But yeah, there's, and then different characteristics in generally the size of the flowers is a common character in separated out in the couplets in the key.
Then there was another question. Is there time to discuss the questionable Hesperoyucca on the border?
Oh yeah. Do you have time?
Yes.
I'll make it quick. So, so Tony Burgess and Richard Falger, separate occasions, collected that plant. And so Raul and I and Andrew went down. We wanted to know what in the world is it. We collected it, did molecular, falls out Newberrii. So you saw that big gap, right? Should we go back? And so the big gap here, how far back is it? Okay. So it's found here. Let's go back another one. No, let's keep this one. Okay, so it's found right about here and in the Grand Canyon. So this whole big gap here. Remember when I said that this area in here in the Colorado River corridor is warmer during the glacial periods in the adjacent areas. So when you have a Holocene or during interglacials, it's going to get really warm, especially in the Holocene. And so these plants died out. So in the ones that are still down here are north-facing slopes. Richard Felger had an idea, so a theory Hesperoyuccas, this is where the ethnobotany can come in. Hesperoyucca whipplei, we know it was used for food. The hearts harvested similar to how agaves are harvested, okay, providing a really good food, sweet food, okay. Now, Hesperoyucca newberrii, which I didn't point out, produces only a single stem. It doesn't produce branches, additional stems. Whipplei peninsularis does. They produce rosettes, they're stems, they're just condensed stems. And so even though I have one reference to the use of newberrii, but most of the uses for whipplei for food is for whipplei for food. So Richard wondered, people lived along here. We know that people inhabited this area 12,000 years ago, around Tanana Saltus. And probably people inhabited along the river, okay? And so, and if these plants were there, they probably used them for food. We know that people used agaves for food, baking, for at least 10,000 years. So, so maybe they knew even way back then, people that live along here, okay? And they may have sort of exacerbated a situation with harvesting a plant that doesn't produce more than one stem, with the warming and drying that's really hitting the Hesperoyuccas that used to grow along here. And so coupled with that climate heating up and all, and with using them for food, may have exacerbated the problem, and they disappeared. So why are they still here? Richard suggested that this is away from the Colorado River, and this is one of the driest places in North America, and nobody would live there. So no one would harvest them. I thought,
Not right.
think about it though. What's not right?
But people would live.
They wouldn't because it's so hot and dry. There's no water. But they lived here, we know that. But there wasn't evidence that they, what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought about it, it's like,
There's plenty of evidence all over Cabeza Prieta, Oregon Pipe, that people have been there over 10,000.
Can you
right.
repeat Sue's comments for the?
So Sue is saying that people did live throughout here. We know that they date back in this area along here 12,000 years ago. And Sue, you're saying that they also lived along here too, away from water. What was that theory?
There's, often cultures are often identified by projectile point artistry, and you can find hearth and projectile points, got Clovis points from in there in that ultra dry area, Clovis points and western stem points in there. Those are the oldest points in North America. That's the start.
Did they live there or did they hunt there?
Yes.
So Sue was saying how they have found Clovis points, projectile points that date back 10 to 12,000 years. And the question, is it amount come down to degrees? How much? I don't know. Was it a factor at all or not at all a factor? I don't know.
I firmly believe they were moving plants around a lot.
I agree with
I
that.
don't know about that particular.
Moving plants around a lot.
Yeah, people were moving plants around all but I don't know about that species.
Hesperoyucca. Yeah, it's so sensitive though. It's that single stem. It'd be really hard to move. Too. I don't know. Okay.
There's some back in the second row there. The question was.
The question is, how high are the Tinaja Saltus? Is that compared to other potential refugia? What do you think, Sue? They're pretty low still. No, I didn't find it in the Tenaz Altus. It was farther. Yeah. Well, yeah, actually, the plant is actually in the southern end of the Najas Altus Mountains. Yeah, so, I don't know. North facing, yeah. There's a herbarium specimen and it has all that information on it, the elevation. Oh, I'm on.
The only bosoms that occur in Sonora are
Interesting.
and also Ceres moved to them too. They were planting on after. And the legend is that the bosoms were race giants that were fleeing a hurricane south. When they reached the top of the Sierra Bacha, the water hit them and they became.
Is that in your paper? Yeah. So Robert was saying how the boojums will grow on north-facing slopes and were moved in the mainland and moved in Sonora, and people moved them. Sari moved them, planted them, right? Yeah, and there's a very, very, very special plant.
Yeah, they're on the north slope. I think they're there. Also, not just that people move them, but it's the only place that these seeds fall. But the only reason I say is that these plants that you're talking about are on the north slope. You know, it seems plausible that maybe people moved them, maybe they didn't, but they something about that particular microhabitat is stable.
Yeah, and the thing, when you see the population of the Hesperoyucca down there, it's on these dry, rocky granite, steep slopes that are very much like what you see in the canyon. Different soil substrate, but granite out here. Yeah, I don't know. I think it'd be really cool. What I think would be neat too, getting back to the pollinators, just think of it. Who pollinates this? That guy that's not, that guy that's there. It does produce fruit. Yep. Yeah, so it must be a local population of moths down there.
You must be exhausted.
Nah, I'm good.
One more question.
One thing, when you find something how do you determine if it's a hybrid or if it's a new species?
That's a great question. I do a lot of my. So the question is a really easy one to answer is how do we determine plants to be a new species or a hybrid? I say that in jest. It's not an easy question. I do a lot of my botany with intuition and what's the word? Not gut, gestalt. Yes. When you get to know plants and all, and I'm not saying I know plants, but there's a familiarity though. You pick out what's weird and then they talk to you. I am going to say they talk to you. And there's stuff up in Grand Canyon. I know it's a new species, some other non-yucca things. But then, so that helps you, that leads you to doing more investigation. So what's it closest to? So you compare with the type specimens and then other specimens that it's close, they think it might be close to. If it's not close to, well, you do more morphological, ecological, biogeographical. Deep history is really important in figuring out what was going on thousands of years, if not even millions. Really important, not only in figuring out how species evolves, but can also help, predicting how plants will do with this climate stuff. So we do molecular too. When molecular first started, I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. But boy, I really do believe you need that molecular work to help support or to shed more light on it. but it also depends on how you interpret molecular results too. So, so you really got to do your homework. And with hybrids, it's the same thing. There's some really good papers, and they do molecular. They do all sorts of really cool things in figuring out not only the hybrids but gene flow and all that. So yeah.
I think, oh, Barbara, do you want to go? All right.
For yucca? So the question is, have there been any roasting pits for yuccas identified? Paul, he left. That's a great question. Probably, I would say probably. The problem is you have to excavate the pits to find out the macro botanical remains, the fibers, the charred fibers and everything, and then analyze them and to see if you can match it, if it's agave or if it's yucca or if it's choya or whatever. And so for some reason, I want to say yes, especially up in Mojave Desert and Paiute territory too. I think Kay Fowler may have done work with that, but I'm gonna look that up. Thank you for asking.
I think we should call it down for right now and thank our speaker again very much for her persistence. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for bearing with our technological challenges.